This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. In the late 1800s, the New York City media landscape was dominated by a fierce battle for daily newspaper supremacy. The two contenders for the top spot were led by near mythic names in the publishing universe: Pulitzer and Hearst. Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World, and William Randolph Hearst owned the competing New York Journal. Both papers cost a penny. Both had enormous staffs consisting of writers, reporters, editors, and photographers. And for better or for worse, the advances made in a relatively brief 10-year period would forever alter the way newspapers were constructed. The banner headline, lurid and salacious stories that were once thought too risque for the general public, blatant sensationalism, the philosophy of, quote, if it bleeds, it leads. All these techniques were pioneered in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And for good reason. Pulitzer and Hearst were two of the wealthiest men in America, and both wanted the title of King of the New York daily newspaper battle. Hearst made the first broadside attack when he lured nearly the entire staff of Pulitzer's elite Sunday edition to come work for the Journal. The promise of salaries unheard of in the newspaper business was just too good to pass up. So they all left. But not for long. Pulitzer came back with offers of even more money and quickly had reclaimed his celebrated staff. Only to have Hearst make still another counteroffer. It was remarked that the sidewalk between the two newspapers had worn thin. One interesting note that, admittedly, I haven't been able to independently verify, but I've been told on numerous occasions, concerns the game of baseball. Up until the early 1900s, professional baseball was played in two leagues, the American League and the National League, just like today, but the best team from each league would never play each other. There would just be an American League champion and a National League champion. Until 1905, that is. The story goes that when the season was over, and the New York Giants had won the National League pennant, and the Philadelphia Athletics had won the American League pennant, a championship series was proposed that would see the two league champions play each other for total baseball supremacy. The series would be sponsored by, and exclusively covered by, the daily newspaper, the New York World. And it would therefore be called the World's Series. Look at promotional pictures from the 1905 Giants. All the old photos have World's Series champions emblazoned across the top, and the word Worlds is not only apostrophized as possessive, it's also italicized, indicating a proper noun, like the name of a newspaper, rather than relating to our planet. Over the past 120 years, it seems to have evolved to be understood by most to mean the best teams in the world, as opposed to a series sponsored by a newspaper as a marketing event, and the connection's never mentioned in mainstream media circles. But it makes sense. One major coup that would have the most lasting effect on journalism in the United States had to do with Hearst successfully poaching the World's Sunday cartoonist responsible for the weekly Yellow Kid cartoons. These were enormously successful weekly satires about everything from politics to business, lifestyle, or sports. With this defection, and the Journal now running Yellow Kid cartoons, Pulitzer needed to find a new cartoonist to continue the World's publication of its own, and he would say original, Yellow Kid cartoons. And he did. This marked the period of the fiercest competition between the two media giants. The headlines were the most aggressive, the stories unparalleled in their stretching of the truth. Accusations were flying, reputations made and ruined, and the Yellow Kid was right there acting as a mirror image of biased opinions and brazen sensationalism every Sunday on both sides of the fight. And the people loved it, to the point that this type of publishing tornado was given the name yellow journalism. And it's considered a low point at least reputationally, in the history of American media. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Homegrown Horror, Part 3. So why do we care about media practices in New York when we're going to be talking about a serial killer's home court advantage in Chicago? Well, many critics argue that yellow journalism had a lot to do with how the story of H.H. Holmes was covered. To begin with, the Chicago World's Fair was major news for the entire 6 months of its run. Everyone wanted to be there. 27 million people made that dream a reality, but those that couldn't make the trip devoured any bit of information they could get. There were thousands of magazines dedicated to covering the fair, and every daily newspaper in the country had a dedicated column to the most up-to-date news out of Chicago. It's kind of like when the Olympics come around, and suddenly everyone cares about platform diving or the long jump or women's 4x100 freestyle relay. And I'm not being snarky. We all legitimately care about that stuff for 2 weeks, and then we experience something of a withdrawal period for a few days after the closing ceremonies, and then we get on with our lives. Well, the Chicago World's Fair lasted 6 months. 6 months of daily coverage of truly extraordinary human advancements that had the nation captivated. But then it was over. The post-fair melancholy was palpable as the city of Chicago quickly emptied to where it felt like a ghost town. Workers began disassembling the massive installations. Even the Ferris wheel came down. The Grand Basin was drained. The hotels shuttered. And most importantly for us, newspaper sales plummeted. What could these yellow journalists do to get their readership back? Well, what if the stories coming out of the South Side neighborhood of Englewood were true? What if a local doctor was actually a murderous fiend who constructed a hotel that was specifically designed for murder? It didn't matter if it was true or not. This guy Holmes was, by now, a known killer and a wanted man. So the papers ran with it. How much of what they reported was actually true? Let's find out. As we covered in Part 1, Holmes financed his early foray into real estate with ill-gotten gains from truly devious insurance scams. He bought not only his former boss's pharmacy, but also the vacant lot across the street, where he swindled and scammed his way into a 2-story mixed-use building with another pharmacy and other stores on the ground level and apartments on the second level. When Chicago won the bidding to be the host city for the World's Fair, Holmes decided to add a 3rd floor to be used as a hotel for the massive throngs of guests surely to congregate for the festivities. It's the design of that 3rd floor and other alleged modifications that are in question. So here are the claims. The hotel contained soundproof rooms to conceal the screams of his murder victims. The 3rd floor was designed with a hallway that was actually a maze that disoriented guests. There were various doors and stairways that led to brick walls or dead ends. The building's several laundry chutes were expanded to be able to handle human victims that would be dropped directly into the basement. Many of the rooms on the 3rd floor had trap doors that led to these laundry chutes. Also, the hotel room doors could only be locked from the outside. The basement had various pits of acid and quicklime to dissolve human remains. There were at least 2 concrete-lined rooms that were fed by a gas line to asphyxiate victims. And there was at least 1 crematorium in the basement. Here's an excerpt from a Harper's article in 1943 regarding the hotel. The basement was perhaps the most remarkable section of the building. It was fitted with an operating table, a crematory, pits containing quicklime and acids, surgical instruments, and various pieces of apparatus which, resembling medieval torture racks, never were satisfactorily explained. Some thought Holmes used these appliances to wring from his victims the whereabouts of their wealth. Others said he used them in experiments which he hoped would prove his pet theory that the human body could be stretched indefinitely, a treatment that ultimately would produce a race of giants. Holmes sometimes destroyed the bodies of his victims completely, sometimes aided by a needy skeleton articulator who answered his advertisement in the paper, would then strip the flesh from their bones and sell the skeletons to medical institutions. So, if true, this place was hell on earth. But it was how Holmes treated the employees that was especially diabolical. According to reports, all employees of what became known as the World's Fair Hotel were required to carry a life insurance policy. The premiums were paid by Holmes, and Holmes had to be the only beneficiary. And I guess there were actually people that were cool with that because he operated with a full staff. But 9 of his employees mysteriously vanished during the time of the fair, all young women. Holmes was also reported to have advertised the need of a wife in the local newspapers, and he entertained potential candidates in his hotel. Several of those women were never heard from again. But a closer look into the hotel reveals, potentially, a different story. First of all, there are pictures of the hotel taken during the World's Fair, and the 3rd floor looks unfinished. There are sections of exterior wall that are still just roughly framed. The condition of the building alone would bolster the claim that Holmes was simply using the alleged building improvements as a way to scam money out of investors and insurers. He never meant for it to be completed. Were there rooms that only locked from the outside? Yes, but these were used to hide stolen furniture when law enforcement came sniffing around to collect. And according to official records, only one of Holmes's victims was actually a tourist visiting the fair. The rest of Holmes's time in Chicago and its depiction in the press and popular media can be ascribed completely to the rise of yellow journalism. Nothing more than sensationalized, often completely made-up stories in order to keep the interest in the fair alive and sell as many papers as they could. The only known murder victim to meet her fate in the hotel was a young girl, just 6 years old. The girl's mother was Julia Connor. Julia traveled to Chicago with her daughter Pearl in the hopes of cashing in on the opportunities available during the fair. She took a job at Holmes's hotel, and the two quickly fell into a passionate affair. When Julia learned that Holmes was seeking a wife, and that she wasn't in the running, she became distraught. Less out of a broken heart, and more due to the fact that she was pregnant with Holmes's child. Julia's death was allegedly the result of a botched abortion attempted by Holmes. Julia would be buried in the basement of the hotel. When young Pearl began asking too many questions about her mother, Holmes decided the only answer was to poison the child and bury her beside her mom. When Holmes was finally captured by the Pinkertons in Boston, it was reasonably believed that he had killed 9 people. But they only had hard evidence for one, his old friend Ben Petezel. We learned about Petezel and his unfortunate children in the previous episode, and although they were sure Holmes had killed the children as well, they could only charge Holmes with the murder of Petezel. As mentioned, of his 9 supposed murder victims, only one was believed to have occurred in the Chicago hotel. Police found skeletal remains of a woman and child believed to be Julia and Pearl Connors, along with some personal items that belonged to Julia. Julia wasn't believed to have been murdered by Holmes, but to have died accidentally during a surgical procedure that went wrong. But the evidence they had against Holmes of the Petezel murder was enough for Holmes to go on trial in October of 1895. H. Holmes was quickly found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting his fate, Holmes sat for several interviews and ultimately confessed to having killed 27 people in Chicago, but he wouldn't give details. Some say the number could be as high as 200, but that seems like a lot. The definitive version of his life story was negotiated and purchased for $7,500 by none other than William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal. He would have his headlines after all. In May of 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Pennsylvania, H. Holmes, just 35 years old, was executed. Prior to his sentence being carried out, Holmes very calmly requested that his body be buried at least 10 feet deep and that his coffin be encased in concrete. These precautions arose from his fear that grave robbers would steal his corpse and sell it for medical dissection, the very trade that got him started years before. When the gallows floor fell away and the rope snapped taut, Holmes's neck didn't break. His body twitched and convulsed for a full 15 minutes, swaying gently from the rope until he finally was pronounced dead. In his last interview with a reporter from the New York Journal, Holmes was quoted as saying, "I can no more fight the urge to kill than a poet can fight the urge to sing. I was simply born with the devil within me." Thanks for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this 3-part miniseries as much as I enjoyed making it. Be sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.